Good evening. This is Ronald Allen with Managing Change Through Effective Communications. Tonight's discussion is all about fantasizing, how we can utilize this mind's capability, your mind, my mind's capability, that is usually cultivated when we were young children to deal with the pressures and challenges of adulthood, of life's changes, as we go through careers, relationships, states of mind, of capabilities, and where we really begin to understand that we are very mortal. So a serious topic, and yet one that we can draw from our childhood and see if we can remember some of those experiences, good and bad, as you know, in our live chats. We always talk about certainly moving towards what we wish, what we're looking for, what we believe we desire, as much as understanding and seeking to appreciate the pain. As we know, when the pupa of a caterpillar turns into the moth, turns into the larvae, and then through metamorphosis turns into the butterfly. Painful experience. Birth is a painful experience. So I'm going to talk about fantasizing and see where we can go with this. Initially, as children, we can create both characters and stories that serve a purpose, where the mind is, in many cases, trying to deal with both a positive or a negative situation. It's a feeling. It's a feeling that is initiated by an experience, by a lack of an experience, by being told how things might be, by the abrupt opposite of what you might be experiencing, and then all of a sudden, the reality, perceived reality, has been changed. You know, they say when we're dreaming, the only confirmation that we are dreaming is that we wake up in a different state. So what state are we actually in? Now, some of these questions I'm going to propose to you tonight don't look for answers in the traditional way. Rather, reflect on your own experience, on your own reality. And then, if you can, look back into your childhood and say, what was my approach to dealing with both the good and the bad, the positive and the not so pleasant of situations? Now, as you know, the difference between psychology and coaching is that psychology wants to keep us in a past state and answer those and say, okay, we can address, we are able to survive. Whereas coaching is really about identifying where we want to go. And that is what fantasizing is really all about. It's where we would rather be. And I think that's a very powerful state, a very powerful desire, a very powerful intent to take us out of what we do not like, what we're not comfortable with, what we do not wish to experience, and begin to craft, when we say create a life, craft your life so that you are very serious, you're very on purpose, you are very in the moment to ensure that the unpleasantness, and maybe not even unpleasantness, just what you will not put up with, doesn't manifest and take over our reality. So in fantasizing as a child, I remember my brother telling us these stories about King Henry. My brother's name was Henry. My wife, my sister Bernadette, and myself. And there was King Henry, Queen Bernadette, and King Ronald. Now I know where I get my ego from. And they were incredible stories. I'm not sure where he got them from, which was just as incredible. The fantasies and the fact that he told us these stories led me into telling stories when I went to school. And I would talk about the telly ants. which now we know on television and the movies, an ant's life. And I think I got that because I used to capture the ants and create nests in glass towers where I could see them hard at work. So the fantasy was this story I'm telling myself, this story I'm immersing myself in is a better story than what I'm experiencing outside. Not that it's bad outside. We have to sometimes put that in check. It's not good or bad. It's a better story, a better reality, a more stimulating, engaging environment. After all, have you noticed that our youth today are spending an equal amount of time on videos as they are, I believe it's about 10,500 hours in the United States, that high school kids spend in school, because the stimulation, the excitement, the mind's play in those environments, and some of them are very healthy. In fact, Jane McGonigal did a PhD report on gamification, and she found that the 10,500 hours, which is standard curriculum for high school kids, is the same equivalent amount of time that kids are spending in video games, in fantasy. That becomes their reality. That's how they speak with one another. That's how they engage with one another. So when parents talk to me and say, I'm not in tune, or my children have tuned out, my only question is, where are they going? And have you found the interest, not the time, the interest to go there with them? Because if we're going to a place that is immediately pushed at us through this technology, which is certainly very different than in my time, and we had to wait for the television to warm up. We did, that's not a joke. Then we have to begin to, and I'm cautious with the words I say, I know I just used the word we have to. As parents, it is a dutiful responsibility to understand the environment our children are in. Whereas when I was growing up, it was our duty to understand what was required of us from our parents, guardians, etc. So there's a massive shift. The elements of fantasies, right? The capabilities, the resources, the resourcefulness that the fantasy provides us. It's an emotional stimulation. And most of us will engage in it willingly and with forethought because it's giving us that emotional stimulation, that energy, that freedom, right? Think of a safe place, an acceptable place, a carefree place. It's a release. And even at the younger ages, I'm talking 1, 2, 3 years old, our minds are quickly receptive to that because that's where the learning is actually taking place. They've actually found that children who are exposed to multiple languages will learn 2, 3, and even 4 languages before they're 6 years old if they are immersed on a daily, if not weekly basis in that language. So what I was saying the other night about not being surprised at how our children can adapt because their baseline is significantly higher than ours as you go through the different age groups. The ability to acquire knowledge and therefore be creative has been heightened, has been increased. And I think that's great. I think that's appropriate. I think that's what should happen. Of course, there are going to be some that fall off the rail tracks. Of course. That's life. Not everyone gets to cross the river without being captured by a crocodile every now and again. So the fantasies that you see people playing out, it's wishful thinking. Can I achieve it in reality? No, then I'll achieve it in my mind. Then there's the other side, the demonic side, where we might have schizophrenia, illusions, bipolarism. Now, whether it's a chemically induced, whether it's a DNA induced, and or brought about by external stimulation, that becomes our reality. And then the challenge for the family and those that are going through these heightened stimulations is, can we better manage them? Can we understand them? Do we have the real capability? And we don't necessarily need the plaque on the wall, because I've seen some family members who, because they have been exposed to this behavior time and time again over years, they have mentally conditioned themselves to hold back a reactionary behavior and use the patience, use the strategy of allowing the other family member to act, and then pull them back in, rein them back in. So it is a give and take, right? It's an ebb and flow. Fantasies are feelings of state and place and stories. And if we can use them to fulfill our needs, we're not on point 24/7. Unlike some of the businesses that would like us to be there, there are some inconsistencies. There are going to be some awakening moments. But the ability to use fantasies to express ourselves, to get past difficult times, to address difficult situations is absolutely crucial. And we've found through synaptic testing, which is of the behavior of what's going on in someone's mind when they're asleep, we've found that it can be channeled. Again, the new, the expression, the only thing new in history is what you don't know. The mind is capable, if we introduce it, if we understand, if we want to begin to understand and learn why we are going through these emotional highs and lows. And I chose fantasies because I know most people might think of a sexual fantasy. They might think of a vacation type fantasy. They might think of a different time and place fantasy. Remember the program Upstairs, Downstairs, how many millions of people watched it? And yet their ancestors were probably the downstairs people. Now, I say that in all honesty. Their ancestors were probably the downstairs people, because that's what the majority of us have been exposed to. Yes, we have material things greater than, say, the turn of the century, 18th, 19th, 20th century. We certainly do. We are still the fantasy. We are still subject to an economic force that keeps us in relative servitude, financial servitude. So as much as the fantasy is, I get in my car and I can drive off into the sunset, I can go off on a cruise, I can go to entertaining complexes, and my standard of living is significantly higher. I have running water all the time, I have fresh food every corner, every block as I drive. There is a price. And then reality kicks in when, of course, we, as you heard the other day with the federal government, federal and state employees were complaining that they missed one paycheck. Now, we know that in financial spending and planning, you're supposed to have at least 6, probably a year, if possible, reserve. So there again is a fantasy that 85% of this country, of the world, does not have it, just as most people in the world do not have computers, even though we taught them and everyone seems to have them. Majority of people still have to go to libraries. So I've kind of come full circle on you, right? I've been talking about fantasies in its abstract, certainly talking about fantasies in terms of mental conditions, and I just touched on them where we talk about it being bipolar, having illusions, schizophrenia, having dream states. The reality is the fantasy that we tell ourselves on a daily basis that we have something that in fact we do not. So I'm going to leave at this stage because I'm kind of hungry. I've been working since about 5 this morning, getting stuff done, and I'm certainly enjoying it. But I'm running low on energy, and I wanted to just talk about this word fantasizing because it's not just in games, it's not just in stories that we tell ourselves. It's how we actually live our lives in comparison to the reality. So if we strip away all the front loaded imagery and say to ourselves, what do I really need? What can I do? What must I actually have? We'll find that a lot of what we've labeled carrying on our back, right, the baggage, it's caused or created a fantasy in our lives, and now it's become somewhat hardwired. And some of you may know, certainly been going through some challenges for some time. It's refreshing to know that you can still cut a smile, you can still, with intent, be on purpose, and decide for yourself that as much as the fantasy is warm and fuzzy, I'd rather deal with reality because, as they say, none of us are getting out of here alive. So, a serious topic, a fantasy of life, and how it blends with the factual reality that we actually have to live in. One to be considered, one to think about. This is Ronald Allen, managing change through effective communications. You know where to find me.